Okay, let's look more at the structures of the body cavities. So first, let's talk about the dorsal cavity. The dorsal cavity is the cavity at the more posterior direction, or in the more posterior direction of the body. This cavity is subdivided into two parts. It consists of the cranial cavity. This cavity houses the brain, so the area within the skull. And we also have the vertebral cavity. The vertebral cavity is the region that houses the vertebral column, also referring to the spine. So the spinal cord sits within the vertebral cavity. So these are the two subdivisions of the dorsal or posterior body cavity. Now in this photo, you can also see the ventral cavity. The ventral cavity consists of this region in purple, pink, and green. And I'll show it on the next slide. So now this is a view, an anterior view of an individual. So this person, imagine they're standing in anatomical position from an anterior view. And the ventral cavity is the cavity that's more towards the ventral or anterior surface of the body. This is subdivided into the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavities. So if we break up these words here, or we look at the meaning of these words, the thoracic cavity is pertaining to the thorax, or pertaining to this region here of the chest, and the abdominopelvic cavity is pertaining to the abdominal and pelvic regions. The thoracic cavity can be further subdivided into the pleural cavities. Here you can see two individual pleural cavities. The pleural cavities hold the lungs. So the lungs sit within the pleural cavities, and the pleural cavity contains fluid, just as any of the other cavities do, that surrounds the lungs, and this fluid helps to reduce friction as the lungs expand. When we talked about of the dorsal cavity, if we go back to this, the brain sits in this cavity, and this cavity is also filled with fluid. And this helps to provide shock absorption, or to protect the brain from any trauma. So having fluid in this region protects the brain from smashing into the skull upon any trauma or upon any sudden movements. And for the case of the lungs in the thoracic cavity, the lungs are protected or surrounded by this fluid to reduce friction as the lungs expand. Also in the thoracic cavity, in addition to the lungs, we have the heart. And the heart, represented within this cavity in blue, and blue here, this is the pericardial cavity. So peri meaning surrounding or around, cardi referring to the heart. So the pericardial cavity surrounds the heart. This also contains fluid. As the heart contracts, there's a lot of movement, and so the fluid in this cavity helps to protect the heart and to reduce friction as the heart contracts. Here we have the superior mediastinum, and so this cavity contains part of the breathing tube. So the trachea runs through the mediastinum, and also some of the major blood vessels, such as the aorta, which leaves the heart. So the thoracic cavity, to summarize, consists of the pleural cavity and the mediastinum, which within the mediastinum, we have the pericardial cavity and the superior mediastinum. Now, this represents the upper cavity of the ventral cavity. And the lower cavity is the abdominopelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity are separated by the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a muscular structure that is at the bottom of the thoracic cavity, and the diaphragm actually lowers as the thoracic cavity expands and the lungs expand when we inhale, and the diaphragm then moves back upward as we exhale, and this aids in the expelling of air from the lungs. And so the diaphragm acts as this separation between the thoracic and abdominopelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity are actually continuous with one another. There's no physical structure that separates the abdominal and the pelvic cavities, and so they're also referred to as the abdominopelvic cavity since they are continuous with one another. These cavities house our abdominal organs, many digestive organs and the associated accessory organs, and the pelvic cavity houses the reproductive organs and also some organs of the urinary system. So taking a closer look at the thoracic cavity, we can see in the center of the thoracic cavity is the mediastinum. Think mediastinum is the middle, so in the middle of our thoracic cavity is the mediastinum. And actually the Latin word for midway. This is the central compartment of the thoracic cavity. And the mediastinum contains the heart and its associated vessels, such as the aorta here we see in red, which carries oxygenated blood from the heart and sends it out to the rest of the body. We can also see the superior and inferior vena cava, which will bring deoxygenated blood back to the heart, to the right atrium, as well as the esophagus, the trachea or the breathing tube, associated nerves. So multiple structures are within this mediastinum here, this central cavity, or central region of the thoracic cavity. As well, we have the pleural cavities. So the pleural cavities hold the lungs and surround each of the two lungs. That pericardial cavity is what surrounds the heart in the mediastinum. This photo just shows a closer up image of the heart and the pericardium. So the pericardium, peri meaning around or surrounding, cardi referring to heart. The pericardium is the membrane or cavity that surrounds the heart. So it's a very thin double membrane structure. And within, there is pericardial fluid. Again, this fluid helps to reduce friction as the heart contracts. The abdominopelvic cavity is divided into two smaller cavities, the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. And a reminder that there's no physical separation between these two cavities. But the peritoneum is a membrane that lines the entirety of the abdominal pelvic cavity. So the peritoneum is a membrane that basically holds in and protects the abdominal and pelvic organs. And so if surgery were to be performed on the abdominal cavity, the physician would need to cut through this membrane, the peritoneum. And similarly, that peritoneum is a membrane that holds fluid which surrounds and provides some gentle cushioning or shock absorption for the organs and allowing for gentle movement of the organs of the abdominal pelvic cavity. So the abdominal cavity specifically is above the pelvic region, and it houses the digestive organs, including the stomach, and accessory organs of the digestive system, such as the liver and gallbladder, and also the small and large intestines. And later in this lecture, we're going to talk about how we can actually pinpoint, using positional terms, the various organs of the abdominal cavity, and how we can describe their location in the abdominal cavity. So the stomach relative to the gallbladder or the liver and so forth. Now the pelvic cavity is inferior to the abdominal cavity, so below, and it contains the male or female reproductive organs and the urinary system organs, including the bladder, the ureters. The ureters are the structures that carry urine from the kidneys to the bladder, and then the urethra at the exit from the body. It also houses, of the digestive system, the rectum and the anus in both males and females. Okay, so based on what we've just discussed about the cavities, let's pause and take a checkpoint. So which cavity contains the spinal cord, the lungs, and the urinary bladder? And number 2, Describe the location of each structure relative to another structure using directional terms. So the key here is these structures relative to another structure. So take a moment and pause the video and give these questions a try as a little test of your understanding. And then once you replay the video, we'll take them up. Okay, so which cavity contains the spinal cord? If you said the dorsal cavity, you'd be correct. And specifically, the vertebral cavity houses the spinal cord. Which cavity contains the lungs? Overall, the thoracic cavity contains the lungs, and the pleural cavities are the cavities that directly hold or surround each lung. And finally, the urinary bladder can be found in the ventral cavity, but specifically in the pelvic cavity, or the less specifically the abdominal pelvic cavity, but to be very specific, in the pelvic cavity. Now describe the location of each structure relative to another structure using directional terms. So I'll just give you some examples here. So one could say that the heart is superior to the abdominal cavity, right? The heart sits above the diaphragm, therefore it's above the abdominal cavity. You could also say that the heart is inferior to the cranial cavity, or inferior to the brain. You could say the bladder is inferior to the stomach, and you could say that the trachea, being part of the thoracic cavity, right? We talked about how it's the trachea in the breathing tube is part of the mediastinum, which is in the ventral cavity. You could say that the trachea is anterior to the spinal cord, because we know the spinal cord is part of the dorsal cavity. Okay, so this table is basically just showing a review of these terms that we've been using, through this lecture. Some that I'm going to point out here. So we talked about cranial versus caudal. So cranio is the combining form for skull. Cephalo, and used in a word, cephalic, meaning pertaining to the head, is just another way of saying the head region. So sometimes you might want to specify skull, the actual bone of the skull, versus just the head region. And therefore we can be even more specific by saying cranio versus cephalo. Now, abdomen is interesting because it can be referred to as abdomen or abdomino, as we saw with abdominopelvic. But laparo is the combining form, or another combining form for abdomen as well. So think if an individual is having laparoscopic surgery, this would be a surgery of the abdominal region, for example. It's a type of surgery of the abdominal region. Now, another one I want to highlight here is the distinction between spinal cord and the vertebrae of the spine. So the spinal cord is the cord of nerves, or the tracts of nerves that run from the brain down through the vertebral column. And those nerves are going to then run down the vertebral column and send out electrical signals to nerves that will run out to the periphery of the body. These electrical signals will excite the muscles of the body and different organs to provide the ability for movement or send out signals from the brain. And therefore, there are two unique terms that are utilized. If we're referring to the actual bones that make up the vertebral column specifically, the combining form is spondyle or spondylo. So if we're referring to the bones that make up the vertebral column that surround the spinal cord, then this would be the combining form here, spondylo. If we're referring to the actual spinal cord itself, so again, the bundle of nerve tracts that run from the brain all the way down through the vertebral column, When we're referring to the nervous tissue specifically, then we can use the combining form myelo. If you have seen an anatomy, myelin refers to the fatty substance that surrounds our nerve cells and helps with propagating or insulating the electrical signal that gets sent from neuron to neuron, speeding up the rate of electrical impulse activity. And therefore, myelo is the combining form for spinal cord. Spondylo refers to the actual bones that surround the spinal cord. And spine O is also used for spine. So making note of these terms, and one other term I want to indicate here, the combining form for the diaphragm is phreno, and I think we've seen this previously in week 1, but to reiterate that the nerve that stimulates the diaphragm to contract, which occurs during breathing, that nerve is called the phrenic nerve. And so the combining form for diaphragm is actually phren-o. This refers to the diaphragm. So now we're going to look more into the divisions of the spine. So different regions of the spine allow for different movements, and therefore they are named differently. Injuries to different regions of the spine affect different nerve pathways, and so we are going to explain the different regions and how this might be visible kind of in various medical conditions. Medical terms will reflect the region of the spine and therefore the function of that region. So the spine has many important functions, including protecting the spinal cord. So again, that spinal cord of nerves sits within the vertebral column, and it also provides structural support for the head, neck, and rest of the body. When we're born, interestingly, the spine actually starts with 33 vertebrae, and then it decreases to 24 as we become adults. And this is because some of the bones in the spine begin to fuse together, fuse to one another. And particularly the sacrum here, we can see that the bones have fused, whereas parts of the lumbar region or the thoracic or cervical spine, we can see the individual vertebrae stacked one on top of the other. So the spine has many important functions in the body. Again, protecting the spinal cord and having that, adding that structural support. And so I've added this table here from your textbook, which shows the divisions of the spine: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. And this photo here nicely outlines that. So we can see if we're looking at an individual in anatomical position. So this is an anterior view of an individual. The spine looks pretty straight within the vertebral column. But if we look from a side view, we can see that the spinal column is actually, the vertebral column has multiple curves to it. Now, if we start at the top, the cervical spine contains 7 cervical vertebrae, and this forms the curve of the neck. The thoracic spine consists of 12 individual vertebrae. Each vertebrae is a single bone, and there are 12 individual bones that make up the thoracic spine. Next, the lumbar spine consists of 5 vertebrae. That forms the lumbar curve, or the lower back, if you will. And this kind of has a forward anterior curve here to it. And then finally, we have the sacrum, which consists of fused vertebrae. So these bones are fused together at the base of the spine here. The coccyx is at the very, very base of the sacrum. And we can see it forms the structure here. So as you come lower, so for example, the lumbar vertebrae takes on the greatest weight of all of the vertebrae. And the bones in this region, the individual vertebral bones, as you can see, they're stacked on top of one another, are actually larger of the lumbar spine, and it holds a lot more weight. So the curves of the spine are really important because these curves actually aid in, humans' ability to be able to stay upright, and it supports the body and provides that strength needed to stay upright as we walk on 2 feet. So on this slide, a little checkpoint on the thoracic spine, on the vertebral column. So the thoracic spine is blank to the lumbar spine. Take a moment and think on this. So the thoracic spine is superior to the lumbar spine, or above. The cervical spine is superior to the thoracic, and the sacral region is inferior to the lumbar region. And I've provided a list of terms here to help with decoding, so that decoding practice, which will be relevant for your quiz, and also for future tests. So being able to decode these terms. In our first week's video, we talked about how when we decode a term, we start with the suffix, right? So kind of the meaning of the suffix, and then we read from left to right, starting at the very beginning of the word. So we'll take a moment. If you want to pause the video and decode these words. Okay, so intervertebral. Let's break this up here. So let's look for prefix, any roots or combining forms, and suffix. Now, the suffix al, al, means pertaining to. Inter is the prefix for between, and vertebra refers to the vertebrae, or the spinal bones. And we can write it out like this. Intervertebral, showing prefix, root, and suffix. So intervertebral means pertaining to, between the vertebrae. Next, we have lumbar sacral. So this would be pertaining to the lumbar region and sacrum, or the lumbar spine and sacral region. And spondylitis refers to inflammation. Itis is the suffix for inflammation. Inflammation of the vertebrae. We saw prior in that table that spondyle refers to the vertebral bones. So inflammation of the vertebrae, so the spinal bones. Okay, let's move on to body planes. So body planes are used to visualize internal structures of the human body, or the internal anatomy. This is particularly pertinent for medical imaging. So imaging devices such as CAT scans, CT scans, also known as X-ray computed tomography, are used to obtain virtual 2D sections of 3D structures, and these are called scans. So we're able to visualize internal structures in slices, if you will, using this type of imaging. And so body sections and scans can be correctly interpreted only if the viewer understands the plane with which the section was made in. So being able to understand what plane that section is being viewed from helps us to correctly distinguish the different structures in an image. So a plane is an imaginary 2D surface that passes through the body. And there are 3 planes that are commonly referred to in anatomy and medicine, highlighted here. So we'll talk about each one individually. The first one is the sagittal plane. So imagine this plane is running from head to toe of an individual and from front to back, if you will, cutting through between the nose and down the midline. So down the medial axis of the body. Another plane is the frontal plane. So in this plane, imagine you are cutting an individual into a front section and a back section. So this plane that runs from here almost left to right, as in you were staring at someone face on. So this would be the frontal plane, and we'll show some images of the different planes. And the third one is the transverse plane, which cuts in the horizontal direction. And so it allows us to visualize, either if you were looking down in a cross-section of the individual or up. And we'll look at photos to clarify this. But here we see the sagittal plane. So again, in the sagittal plane, it's as if you're cutting straight down, and therefore you can see into or see from the side view of an individual the organ. So if we're going to orient ourselves by looking at this image, this plane divides the body vertically into right and left sides, and it can also be called the lateral plane. If this goes directly down the middle of an individual, we call this the mid-sagittal plane. So mid-sagittal being directly down the middle. Anywhere off of the middle, and we would just say the sagittal plane. Now, it can be of a human, or we can also refer to a plane running down the middle of an organ. And this would also be referred to as the mid-sagittal plane, cutting down that organ. So here we can see the sagittal view of an individual. From this orientation, you can get a very clear look at some of the organs of the abdominal cavity. We can see the intestines. We can see organs of the pelvic cavity. So we see the uterus and the rectum and anus, for example, of the digestive tract. Now you can also see a side view of the vertebral column, so where the spine would be sitting. Now, this is showing a sagittal cut of an individual's head, and so you can see a lateral view into a person's brain through an MRI image of the brain. So MRIs are commonly performed with these views, and so it gives us a nice visualization of the different regions of the brain through providing many slices or many 2D scans of the brain and from the medial to lateral direction. So the frontal plane is the plane that divides the body or an organ into an anterior front portion and a posterior rear portion. So here we can see if a section is taken from the frontal plane, it's as if you are staring at the individual at an anterior view. So here, this provides us with a nice anterior view. This is the pelvic bone here, and this is a CT scan of the abdominal pelvic region. We can see the liver here. We can see the esophagus, and then coming down, we can see all the structures of the abdominal region using a view of the frontal plane. And here we have a frontal view of the brain. So we can see this particular image. The individual is perhaps facing away from us, and we're seeing a posterior view, and this cut allows us to see the rear portion of the brain. The frontal plane is often referred to as the coronal plane as well. This is just another name for it. And finally, the transverse plane. Imagine we're taking a horizontal 2D section or view of the body. So it divides the body horizontally into an upper and a lower portion. So now imagine we're looking down into a cross section of the body. We can see the spinal cord, which would be, from this view, essentially coming out of the page and at you by looking at it in this way. And we can see some abdominal organs, which are technically more superior, if you will, but we can see a section of them from this cut. So you can see a variety of organs and structures by looking in the transverse plane. It's also called the axial plane. And these views that we see, we call them cross sections. So here we can see a cross section of the brain. You can see these would actually be the eyes, the two white little circles here. And in this way, we can look down into the brain, and we can see a surface of the brain from looking from the upper portion, if you will. And here shows a CT scan of the brain from a similar view. Now, we're going to divide or talk about the divisions of the abdominopelvic region. So in the medical field, dividing the abdominopelvic area into 9 regions allows for added specificity. Each region is given a specific name And each of those regions contains specific organs. So this allows us to be able to clearly communicate to medical staff where pain is being experienced, or where a specific structure is, or a specific wound is on a patient. And so there are 9 abdominal pelvic regions. Now, if we start from the top right here, now this individual is in anatomical position, and I'm referring to their anatomical right. So we're facing this individual, but this would be their right. And the first region is the right hypochondriac region. Now, this name originates because hypo means lower and chondro means cartilage. And this is referring to the cartilage of the rib cage. So the right hypochondriac region is the upper right region below the ribs. So upper means below or lower, chondra means cartilage. More central at the top is the epigastric region. We talked about how epi means above, gastra means stomach, so pertaining to above the stomach. This particular region is called the epigastric region. And then we have the left hypochondriac region on this side. Now below and in line with the lumbar spine, there is the right and left lumbar region. The umbilical region is in the center here because this is where the navel is located, and the umbilical cord was once attached to the belly button when you were in utero. The right and left iliac regions align with or is pertaining to the ilium. The iliac crest is a bone of the pelvic bone. And so the right and left iliac region are the right and left lower regions here. And finally, the hypogastric. Hypo means below, so hypogastric, the lower gastric region. Now, because we have an awareness of these particular subdivisions of the abdominal pelvic region, we can now pinpoint particular structures that are located in each of these regions. Therefore, if an individual is presenting to hospital with pain in the upper right hypochondriac region, we can say, okay, pain in the right hypochondriac region, that could suggest a condition of the gallbladder. So perhaps this individual is having a gallbladder attack. Or if pain is in the right iliac region, then pain in the right iliac region may suggest appendicitis or inflammation of the appendix. So having an awareness of these abdominal pelvic regions provides practitioners with a way to clearly communicate the location of pain and to be able to infer where pain might be originating from. Now, there's a less specific division of the abdominal pelvic region, and this involves dividing it into the right upper quadrant, left upper, right lower, and left lower. So this is also a nomenclature that's commonly used in medicine, just a little bit less specific, but still points to the specific structures here, such as the left upper quadrant holding the stomach, part of the small or the large intestine, the right upper quadrant holding liver, gallbladder. So still provides specificity, just a little bit less specific than the 9 quadrants. Okay, so checkpoint, identifying the abdominal pelvic region where each structure is located. The spleen, the liver, the bladder, appendix, and gallbladder. So I'm going to come back to this image. So here we can see the bladder is located here. And if you said hypogastric region, you would be correct. So the bladder is located in the hypogastric region. We can see the appendix here in the right iliac region. We can see the gallbladder in the right hypochondriac region. Stomach largely sits in the epigastric region. I think that covered everything that was there. Okay. And finally, you can also describe the location of pain, which is commonly done in medicine, associated with the following terms. So appendicitis, ruptured spleen, or heartburn. So particular conditions that are associated with a given structure in the body. Heartburn is commonly associated with the stomach region or the lower esophagus, where acid from the stomach moves up into the esophagus. Therefore, a patient may experience pain or sensation in the epigastric region, if this is the case. Now I'm going to go back to this photo here. And the other question was referring to a ruptured spleen. So the spleen is located in the upper left quadrant, more specifically here in the left hypochondriac region, kind of behind the stomach, tucked under the diaphragm. Okay,